Fukuyama, Political Order and Political Decay, chapters 25 through 28, lecture 2. And with this lecture, we move to chapter 27 and 28, which are the opening chapters of the part of the book devoted to the spread of democracy. So we're moving into the next phase of the book here. I plan to cover chapters 27 and 28 in a single lecture. So this will be the last of 2 lectures on chapters 25 through 28. So chapter 27 is entitled, Why Did Democracy Spread? And the main upshot of the article is, or of the chapter, is that it wasn't just about the spread of ideas. It wasn't just that the idea of democracy caught on and spread social reform, but also that there was this rising middle class created by industrialization, and also the particular way the kind of spread of democracy is particularly related to the way in which this rising middle class, as well as the working class created by industrialization, were mobilized by political parties. So again, there's an important story, not just of material causation, but leadership or decisions made by political leaders. So the way that political parties tapped into these social changes that were going on. That's an important part of the spread of democracy too. Now he gives you a few figures. Figure 19 on page 401. This gives you the simplistic and inaccurate portrait of what the spread of democracy would mean if you attribute it to the influence of democratic ideas. See an arrow just saying a change in ideas leads to a spread of democracy. That's the primacy of ideas picture. It is not accurate since it doesn't really explain why the idea of democratic equality had the power when and where it did. Why did these ideas take? And the way I like to think about this is that while it might make sense, right, to argue that ideas and changes in ideas can drive social change, because of course there's a way it just intuitively makes sense that how we think affects how we act. And so if you change the way people think, you'll change the way that they act. But there are lots of ideas out there. And so if in accounting for the way that societies change, a lot of times what you need to be able to account for is, why did these particular ideas catch on here at this time? Right? You've got to find what is it that's going on in society at that time that makes these ideas fit so well in driving people's behavior, right? Because like say, for example, feudalism is an idea that people still, are aware of, and some people probably prefer feudalism in some form or another to modern society. But I mean, it's not simply the fact that, feudalism lacks intrinsic power in its ideas for why it's no longer dominant, but also you could say because it just, in many ways, it is so utterly unsuited to the way that society is presently organized. So you need ideas that can actually catch on somehow with other social factors. And so in order for democratic ideas to catch on and spread, you need an added consideration involving things like economic growth and social mobilization, so in other words, the creation of new social groups, where the growing division of labor in society created by economic changes creates new social groups, which social groups put pressure on the state to open up and become more accountable, right? That's a more adequate understanding of the process of change. So this would be an alternative to the primacy of ideas. Sorry, let me see if I can get it where you can see it. Which is where you see how economic growth leads to social mobilization, which then leads to democracy. So that would be kind of like the materialist picture, which then leaves out entirely the ideas. Now, that's what he calls Marx's insight, Karl Marx, that the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and the industrial wealth, and the working class are produced by capitalist modernization. Because as Barrington Moore, who was a social scientist in the 20th century, once said, where there's no bourgeoisie, there's no democracy. So where you don't have that kind of middle class that's created by the development of capitalism and industrialization, where you don't have this middle class or bourgeoisie, you don't get democracy. And this is like a historical correlation, which, is loosely related to the, kind of the ideas of Aristotle about the need for this kind of middling element in society in order for society to be stable. But to say no bourgeoisie, no democracy is to say that the development of a middle class is necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient to produce democracy. It's not the case that everywhere that you get a kind of modern middle class, you necessarily get democratic government. It's just that where you don't have that middle class, by and large, you don't get democracy. So it's necessary, but it might not be enough. And just old established landowners and agrarian peasants just are not the stuff of which democracy is made. It's just not the case. That's on page 403, 404. But note that when you're talking about liberal democracy, you're talking about rule of law combined with accountability, right? So liberal democracy is more complex than just elections. So talking about the rise of liberal democracy, you have to kind of talk about this tantamount, this sort of combined sort of elevation of rule of law and accountability. And this is one of those areas where the middle class and the working class, as created by industrialization, could have different preferences. Right. So traditionally, the middle class is very invested in rule of law because they are property owners. They are owners of wealth, and they want a strong legal system to protect their property, which to a socialist or to a communist or to somebody in the working class could look like a sort of self-interested desire to have their property protected, whereas the working class sort of historically has been more in favor of sort of putting democratic pressure on the government to redistribute resources. So kind of more interested in responsiveness to the people and less interested, not as much interested in strict rule of law. So you've got kind of rule of law and accountability, and it's not the case that everybody has an equal interest in both, but eventually the package of the two gets endorsed by the middle class and at least part of the lower class. So this kind of liberal democratic combination of democracy with property protecting rule of law becomes the formula, right, for liberal democracy. And then this middle class, in order for kind of democratization to occur, the middle class, so to speak, the bourgeoisie, and at least part of the working class need to displace the power of the older groups in society in order to actually get institutionalized liberal democracy, right? Because it's not just ideas change and then poof, everything happens. As I've emphasized before, there is a real power struggle guided by ideas of justice and interest, but a power struggle nonetheless in society that in order to kind of change institutions, you've got to you have to displace the status quo. If you want to get liberal democracy from out of an aristocracy, you have to displace to some degree those aristocrats. You've got to lessen their power, and so that this requires rising social groups to work together to achieve that. And although, again, the working class traditionally has been more concerned with redistribution, while the middle class has been more concerned with property rights, that's one of the reasons why there are several instances where the middle class will throw in its lot with kind of the old order, the older aristocratic powers, because that old order is willing to promise rule of law and protection of property. So the middle class is not always necessarily an ally of democratization. It may choose the security of property under a more authoritarian form of government if they think the alternative is some form of unacceptable socialistic appropriation of their property, if that's what they think. He talks about this on pages 406 through 407. But here's the thing. It's not enough to have the ideas of democracy. It's also not enough to have a middle class and a working class produced by economic modernization. Those two things both help, but you also need political parties. You need organized political parties of some form in order to pull this off. Because social groups, middle class, working class, we use these kind of categorical denominations to classify people. But just because people all belong to the same class, classification doesn't mean that they all think and act as a group. So for example, some people have blue eyes. That's a classification. So in principle, you could have a social group made up of blue-eyed people. But for the most part, people don't organize themselves and mobilize along that dimension. Like the fact that a bunch of us are classified as having blue eyes doesn't actually turn us into a group that thinks and acts as a unit, right? So even when you have these classes, like the working class, a whole bunch of people that have in common that they, work in, that they're lower level wage earning employees, for the most part, providing, goods or services within larger economic units. The fact that there are a bunch of people that can be classified that way doesn't mean that they all have what Marx would call class consciousness, that actually think of themselves as belonging to a cohesive group with shared interests that they must act on. So even when you have these new groups emerging, in order for that to lead to any kind of social change, they need to be able to act collectively as a group, not merely as some kind of passive classification, but as an active group. And that's where political parties come in, sort of mobilizing these people into collectively acting groups. Social groups are not automatically united in their interests, and they're not always able to act collectively. Right? Sometimes you need leaders. You need people who take the lead and organize how things are done. So political parties are the institutional means of mobilizing political activity, of mobilizing these social groups in order to apply pressure on society to get those institutional changes. That's where you need parties. But here's the thing. Here we've been talking about a class transformation, right? The emergence of the middle class and the working class. But parties can mobilize around things other than class. They can mobilize around ethnicity. They can mobilize around religion. They can mobilize around other cultural factors. They can mobilize around foreign policy issues, and so on and so forth. So class is not the only, this is what, social scientists, I can't remember if Fukuyama uses this term, but social scientists talk in terms of what are called social cleavages, meaning the different ways that society can be divided into groups. So class is one potential social cleavage, right, where the society can be divided in terms of which class do you belong to. But ethnicity could be another way of dividing things up. Religion could be another way of dividing things up. Region could be a way of dividing things up. You hear about like the urban-rural divide, or you hear about, the conservative-liberal divide, or you can hear about, kind of like the upper class, the 99% and the 1%. There are many different ways of chopping up society. And so, parties, political action can potentially be mobilized in different ways. There are different ways that you can try to appeal to build a group with appeals to different parts of a person's interests or identity. So class is not the only way that parties can be put together, but you need something like political parties in order to take these latent kind of groups of citizens and actually turn them into moving groups acting collectively for particular interests. And since parties can form different strategies of appeal to build support, like party leaders, they're not just passively responding to changes in society. They can look out there and be like, let's tap into this issue. Let's tap into this division. Let's, deliberately recruit evangelical Christians, or let's deliberately recruit industrial workers, or what have you. Like leaders can have strategies to build support, and that's what makes them, as Fukuyama says, semi-autonomous. That parties are not just simply the tools of social classes. Party leaders have to work with the society that's there, right? They can't wish for another society. Nobody could build a political party in the United States on the basis of support from the peasantry, because there is no peasantry, right? So the society you have shapes what kinds of strategies you can follow in order to try to build a viable governing party. But society gives you, there are options oftentimes where you can choose how you're going to recruit and build a party. So for example, was it simply foreordained in the United States, for example, that the party that tended to champion redistributive economic policies, at least after the New Deal, the Democrats, would also be the party that supports, like pro-choice legislation with regard to the issue of abortion, right? Like in the United States, the Democratic Party is the home both of redistributive policies and of pro-choice policies. But, under, kind of an alternative scenario, there might have been a situation where those alignments were different. So the way that the different social groups align is partly a product of the choices made by party leaders about the kinds of coalitions they want to build in order to hold on to power. So parties cannot be treated as sort of a secondary phenomenon when social groups are the real thing, because in part which social groups really form into cohesive actors is partly based on strategic decisions made by party leaders about which groups to try to mobilize. That's why, for example, certain ethnic differences in Africa, like in one country, like Rwanda or something, the Hutu-Tutsi divide became politically murderous when that same divide in neighboring countries was treated as more or less irrelevant. That was because it was mobilized deliberately by leaders in one place, but not in others. So the summary of all of this, which he gives, is on page 410, near the bottom, where he says, a stable democratic system will emerge only if these newly mobilized groups are successfully incorporated into the system and allowed to participate politically. Conversely, instability and disorder will occur if those groups do not have institutionalized channels of participation. In this context, ideas can still be very important, but they are related to changes in other dimensions of development. So, as he says later on, ideas were important and had their own autonomy, but receptivity to ideas was shaped by the social context and deep economic changes. And so the more adequate picture of everything that happened is this one here, where you have economic growth leads to social mobilization. This social mobilization leads to changes in ideas. Political parties try to organize these new social groups, and one of the things they do thereby is create pressure to democratize things. Political parties can also try to strengthen the development of rule of law, and at the same time, these changes and ideas that are born of social changes, in their turn, lead to the rise of belief in the unique legitimacy of more accountable or democratic government. So you see, there are lots of things at play. It's one of the reasons why it's so hard to have a predictive theory about this kind of stuff. Now, that's it for chapter 27. In chapter 28, he moves on to what he calls the long road to democracy, where he talks about the development of democracy, particularly in Europe. And there are only really a few things that I want to draw out of this chapter, a few main insights. So, as he says, in 1848, you have a lot of sort of Republican mobilization in Europe, sort of anti-monarchical, anti-aristocratic mobilization, trying to create a more accountable and democratic society. And the contagion of ideas in 1848, the belief in these ideas, was within the middle classes. And the middle classes, really are kind of electrified by these ideas, and they spread. But overall, there was a failure. By the time all of the agitation was done, all of the aristocratic and monarchical powers were still there. It hadn't really changed anything. That's one of the reasons why, from very early on, the Arab Spring in 2011 was likened to 1848, a contagious kind of process of outbreaks of protest and calls for reform across lots and lots of countries in a region. But at the very end of it, ultimately, very little change. So the middle class is mobilized in 1848 by these new ideas, but ultimately the middle class was not big enough and united enough to actually establish a new order, right? So you got the failure of 1848 because the middle class was not big and organized enough to carry it through to the end. Whereas in the 20th century, in this on pages 416 through 418, when you get to the 20th century in a lot of these places, now you really do have the social basis for mass democracy. The middle class is bigger, the working class is bigger, so they become more potent social forces that can be mobilized to have a real effective push for democratization. Now, from early on, right in the 1800s, there were principled objections to democracy, to universal equal suffrage, on the grounds that the working class, women, and other groups were not really able to cast good votes for the public good. So the argument was you need to have a certain degree of experience, a certain degree of knowledge, maybe even property, in order to be really responsible in your vote. Others argued that societies would end up being dominated by elites no matter what, and so it didn't really matter if you had democracy. Democracy fundamentally wouldn't change things in the end. It might change which particular elites were in charge, but it wouldn't change the overall elite structure of society. And of course, there were also objections, based on racism, that we're not going to extend equal suffrage to everybody because the races aren't equal. That was obviously a very important objection in the United States in the 19th century and part of the 20th century, most of the 20th century. And these objections are still around in some form or another. The objection on the basis of knowledge, the objection on the basis of elitism, the objection on the basis of inequality. And it's far from clear, as he says, that the solution to our current problems will be brought about by more democracy. Right? This is something that he talks about on 422 and 423. He says, I'll read a little bit. But echoes of virtually all of these 19th century conservative arguments remain in contemporary political discourse. It is common, for example, for elites to complain about Democratic voters choosing populist policies. From their perspective, Democratic electorates do not always choose well. They may choose short-term demands over long-term sustainability. They often vote on the basis of personality rather than policies. They sometimes vote for clientelistic reasons. They may want to redistribute income in ways that will kill incentives and growth. In the end, these fears do not amount to a convincing argument for systemic franchise restriction. As in the 19th century, elites are often good at dressing up their own narrow self-interest as universal truths. But voters in democracies don't get things right all the time either, especially in the short term. Moreover, it is not clear that the solution to contemporary governance problems lies in ever higher levels of popular participation. As political scientist Bruce Kane argues, most voters simply do not have the time, energy, or expertise to devote to the careful study of complex public policy issues. When the higher levels of democratic participation are encouraged by putting more issues before voters through mechanisms like public referenda, the result is often not the accurate representation of popular will, but the domination of the public space by the best organized and most richly resourced interest groups. The creation of merit-based bureaucracies, ultimately accountable to the public, but protected in many ways from the vagaries of democratic politics, is one expression of the concerns raised in these now forgotten arguments against the spread of democracy. End of quotation. Right, so that's a very interesting reflection on this question of, the place of democracy and the place of kind of non-democratic aspects of politics in generating a sustainable common good, or at least concern for the common good. Now, just one other thing from this chapter that he notes is that in places such as England, it was oftentimes actually the conservatives who were extremely important for the building of democracy. The expansion of the franchise. That in England, for example, the expansion of the franchise was partly driven by conservative groups, which might seem counterintuitive. But the idea is that these conservatives, say Disraeli, used issues such as nationalism, foreign policy issues, etc., to shift their bases of support so that they weren't simply reactionary defenders of the old order anymore. So the idea was, well, if we're a party representing an older order that is quickly being eclipsed as a result of industrialization, unless we want to disappear as a party, we have to change our platform. We have to change the groups that we rely upon. And so Disraeli, for example, rebuilt the Conservative Party. It was still, the defender of the aristocracy and of traditional privilege, but it also made an appeal to nationalism, to empire building, which was very popular with parts of the working class and the peasantry. So it was actually a case where sort of once the franchise was in place, there can be a logic to expanding it as a way of maintaining an electoral majority. Like, hey, these peasants are really patriotic. So if we want to stay in power, let's advocate to extend the franchise to them because they'll vote for us, the patriotic party. That's kind of the idea. You can see this on page 425 in the middle. The British pattern of democratization being initiated by elite parties rather than pushed from below by grassroots mobilization was not unique. Political scientist Ruth Collier notes that the kind of top-down process she labels electoral support mobilization drove the ins to enfranchise the outs in Switzerland, Chile, Norway, Italy, and Uruguay, as well as in Britain. These cases illustrate the way institutional arrangements can become self-reinforcing. Once the principle of electoral politics is established under a limited franchise, incumbent parties can attempt to stay in power by seeking new voters, shifting to new issues, and reaching out across class lines. So that's an important part of the process. This wasn't just a working class, sort of left-wing driven process, this expansion of the franchise. It had populist and conservative elements as well. So that's all that I have to say about Chapter 28. So in the next set of lectures, we'll move on to the next chapters in Fukuyama.